But we begin with President Donald Trump announcing the departure of the Director of National Intelligence via tweet yesterday afternoon. He wrote, "I am pleased to announce that highly respected Congressman John Ratcliffe of Texas will be nominated by me to be the Director of National Intelligence. A former U.S. Attorney, John will lead and inspire greatness for the country he loves. Dan Coats, the current director, will be leaving office on August 15th. I would like to thank Dan for his great service to our country. The acting director will be named shortly." The New York Times reports that Coats, a veteran Republican lawmaker and former ambassador to Germany, had long wanted to go and told the president and vice president that he was ready to move on during a meeting last week. Coats was known to give blunt intelligence assessments, breaking with the president on big topics like North Korea and Vladimir Putin.
We have some breaking news. The White House has announced on Twitter that Vladimir Putin is coming to the White House in the fall.
Say that again?
Vladimir Putin coming
Did I
to
hear you? Did I hear you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's going to be special.
So we go from a man who, by most accounts, spoke truth to power in Dan Coats to now a nominee for DNI who is widely seen as a Trump loyalist.
Well, boy, he also, not only that, Mika, he was also one of the most embarrassing members during the Mueller hearings. You could disagree with what Robert Mueller said and did at times, I suppose, but he was screaming and yelling, talking about how Mueller should be ashamed of himself for doing exactly what he was directed to do by the Justice Department. Without a doubt, and we talked about it in real time when we really didn't know much about John Ratcliffe at all, we said in real time it was one of the most embarrassing performances of a very, very embarrassing day for those Republican judiciary members.
And you should mention that third-term Congressman John Ratcliffe was U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Texas from 2007 to 2008, while he served 4 terms as mayor of Heath, Texas, then a city of about 7,000 people. Ratcliffe, a member of the House Judiciary Committee, also joined the Intelligence Committee earlier this year, pushing investigations into the use of FISA warrants and the president's allegations of bias against him at the FBI. The New York Times reports that Ratcliffe privately met with Trump about the DNI job just a week before he lectured former special counsel Robert Mueller in Wednesday's hearing, a performance that the president shared via Twitter. And on Fox News yesterday, Ratcliffe continued to call the report meaningless.
Americans need to know this as they listen to the Democrats and socialists on the other side of the aisle. Volume 2 of this report was not authorized under the law to be written. The chairman this morning, when he said Donald Trump is not above the law, he's not. But he damn sure shouldn't be below the law, which is where Volume 2 of this report puts him.
At best this week, the person who learned the most about the Mueller report during Wednesday's hearings was Robert Mueller, and that's sad but true. And really what it meant is that the Mueller report and its conclusions weren't from Robert Mueller. They were written by what a lot of people believe was Hillary Clinton's de facto legal team, people that had supported her, even represented some of her aides. And so the Mueller report, it's really going to be difficult for the Democrats or anyone to rely upon the findings of a report when they just listen to the man whose name was on top of it not have a command of what was even in it.
Well, you know, what a clown show for a guy like that to be attacking a Marine hero, a guy that changed the FBI. He doesn't know what Robert Mueller did or didn't do. Maybe he didn't give a type of performance that Ratcliffe gave, screaming and humiliating himself. And by the way, Mika, Ratcliffe was the guy who I think spurred a discussion here where I asked the question, if Republicans are really, I hate to even call him that, a Trumpist, a Trump sycophant, is going to call every Democrat a socialist, can Democrats call Radcliffe a fascist? Because it seems fair to me that if they're going to mislabel Democrats who are not socialists, then Democrats should just start calling Radcliffe a fascist and call him a fascist throughout this entire process, call him a fascist for the rest of his career until this fascist apologizes to capitalists who are Democrats who he has mislabeled. So, Jonathan Lemire, let me start with you, and then we'll get to the ugliness of this election. Is this really a guy that can get 50 votes from the United States Senate in a time when Susan Collins, who's already looking at a loss in Maine because of her vote on Supreme Court nominees, when you have Susan Collins in Maine, when you have Cory Gardner in Colorado, when you have Joni Ernst in Iowa, are they really going to vote? They're up in next year. Are they really going to vote for a clown like this? And yes, he's a clown. He acted like a clown last week, and he basically is spewing words that he reads on Donald Trump's Twitter feed and on conspiracy websites. Are they real? Will there be a majority of members in the United States Senate voting to confirm this man to the most important position in America's intelligence community?
I mean, Joe, you just mentioned the names that everyone's going to be watching. There's going to be incredible scrutiny and pressure on those handful of Republicans who sort of hold this nominee's fate in their hands. I mean, certainly Mitch McConnell has a way of getting Republicans in line, but I don't know that it's a guarantee here. And I think it underscores just what a shift this is going to be from Dan Coats. I mean, Coats was someone who, as outlined earlier, was known as someone who could speak truth to power and publicly broke with the president on a number of issues and did so privately in the confines of the Situation Room, whether it was Iran or North Korea or early on where this fight against ISIS stood, and certainly on Russia, where Coats time and time again warned about Russia's not just what it did in 2016, but what it could do again. And of course, we know there's no subject that infuriates Donald Trump more than suggesting that Russia played a role in his 2016 election, so thinking that it would sort of delegitimize it some way and perhaps could again. And now he gets, by all accounts, a loyalist, someone who, yes, as the Times reported, and we have as well, spoke to the president about this a few weeks ago, and who last week used his appearance in the Mueller hearing, which you said raised all sorts of questions and sort of stood in stark contrast to the quiet dignity of Robert Mueller there, used it as an audition, a final audition for this job, and delighted the president, who has been telling, not only has posted on Twitter about it, but is telling aides that this is the kind of person he wants as DNI.
Well, Andrea Mitchell, this is a type of person he also wanted at the Fed, and Herman Cain didn't make it to the Fed. Neither did Stephen Moore. So I'm wondering if we're looking at a situation like that where the president throws red meat to the crowd, to his base, knowing that I would guess Richard Burr, one of the few Republicans that's acted honorably throughout this entire process and ran a very bipartisan Intel committee investigation, I would find it hard to believe that Richard Burr could vote for this man, or the other North Carolina senator who is up for re-election next year, or those I named earlier. What are you hearing?
Well, it's really notable that Richard Burr did not issue any kind of statement about Radcliffe, praising Radcliffe as you would expect if he were a partisan, a political figure. He has not been. In fact, he and Mark Warner had only on Thursday released that stunning report. We're saying that 50 of our states, all 50 states, had been attacked by Russia. And it was exactly that. In that interview you played a clip of last July in Aspen, Dan Coats, in the rest of that interview, which has gone relatively unnoticed, he was very, very clear about Russia's role. And it was 3 days after the disastrous summit in Helsinki when President Trump had, by name, said that he believed Vladimir Putin over the intelligence agencies and over Dan Coats. So the fact that 3 days later, Dan Coats was willing to stand up and go into chapter and verse of what the threat from Russia was was a signature of the man, of what he had done before in the Senate, of what he had done as ambassador to Germany, and significantly how he rose to the level of DNI, which was not the expectation because of his political background, some diplomatic background. But he really was a truth teller and one of the few around the president. And now what you have is, with the departure of Jim Mattis, you have very few people willing to stand up to the president. And notably, in the president's announcement on Twitter, even though the two had discussed this a week ago, the fact that he announced this on Twitter, where Coates, after weeks of leaks that people like Fred Fleitz, a very controversial former Bolton aide, was being considered for the job, said that he was going to step aside. But the fact that it was announced that way, as it was with Tillerson, you remember the humiliation of that, was significant. And also the fact that he said that an acting director would be named. By law and by practice, the deputy DNI, a very highly esteemed intelligence officer, Sue Gordon, a career person, should be stepping up and should immediately become acting DNI. So now it's clear that he is planning to bring someone in from the political sector, and that is very troubling to the intelligence community.
I was going to ask you, David Ignatius, you've spent years, obviously, covering the intel community closely and have from time to time talked about events in past administrations that have caused a real crisis of confidence inside the intel community. How does this stack up?
I think this is the most serious attempt yet by the Trump administration to politicize intelligence. It's something Donald Trump tried to do from day one almost. He went out to the CIA and gave a very political speech in front of the wall of stars for the CIA's fallen heroes. There are a lot of CIA officers who, to this day, resent that. This is the latest and probably the most serious attempt to bring political figures into control of our intelligence community. Ratcliffe has been very much a party line man. His comments on Mueller you discussed earlier. Just want to say briefly that what the danger of this is. Dan Coates was an unlikely hero. He was a politician himself, but he won the trust of his workforce by pushing back. The day of the Helsinki summit, when Donald Trump seemed to be siding with Vladimir Putin, on his own, Dan Coates released a statement essentially defending the intelligence community. He didn't ask permission of the White House. He just did it, and people loved him for that. The workforce in the intelligence community, as near as I can tell, is traumatized. People are looking over their shoulders. They're worried if does anybody have their back. There increasingly is a narrative about the deep state that's being pushed by Republican members of Congress. They feel that they're in the bullseye. The final point to make, and this may be the most important one, we depend for our security on the cooperation of key intelligence partners around the world who can get to places that our intelligence officers can't. Those services, I know, are increasingly worried about sharing their most precious secrets with the United States because of this wobble from President Trump, from the White House, from his nominees in terms of oversight of intelligence. It worries them. If they begin to reduce the flow of information in the United States, we are less safe, period.
James Fellows, I want you to talk about what's happened over the weekend in DNI, but I want to ask you a larger question that we've wrestled with on this show from the beginning of Donald Trump's rise. We continue to wrestle with it right now. In fact, I'm finishing up a book on Donald Trump, and going back and getting perspective, it shocks me how many times the man will throw out red meat and say something insulting. Like, for instance, he attacked the Pope the morning that Nikki Haley endorsed Marco Rubio in South Carolina. And we all just stopped at the time and said, why in the world would he do it? Well, you know, he got the endorsement off the front page. So I've been talking about ground noise versus signal. Let's look at this weekend. And we have him obviously tweeting calculated attacks on Elijah Cummings. It's painfully obvious that he was trying to get the reaction that he got. And then we have this other news that's going to impact us through, you know, the next year and a half. I'm just curious. You've been around this a very long time. How do we separate the signal and the ground noise, and how fast do we run after that bait that is offensive, that is racist, but is also exactly what Donald Trump wants us to run after?
This, of course, is the fundamental question, or one of many, that we're all wrestling with every week for the past couple of years and for the weeks ahead. And I think this weekend shows it in particularly important relief, because on the one hand, the noise, if you will, the attacks on Representative Cummings were genuinely offensive, genuinely shocking, genuinely racist, and I think in a stark way that it had been somewhat concealed in some of his Donald Trump's previous distractions. So they deserved actual attention, while the announcement made that same day about having Representative Ratcliffe as the head of the DNI director, that also is important in a different way. It's worth just saying for 10 seconds, the history of this particular job is why this appointment is so disturbing. As David was saying, this was a job created after the Iraq War as a way of avoiding the politicization of intelligence. And the people who've been in it have different backgrounds, from military intelligence professionals to ambassadors to Dan Coats, who, as David was saying, has sort of grown into this job. But they all have taken it with the utmost seriousness. So I think it's both halves of the yin-yang puzzle that is Donald Trump we're having to deal with simultaneously.
Yeah.
All right. Up next, we're going to get to President Trump escalating his criticism of Congressman and Oversight Committee Chairman Elijah Cummings. Top Democrats are rebuking his comments, along with Baltimore's largest newspaper, whose editorial board is out with a new piece entitled, "Better to Have a Few Rats Than to Be One." You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.